All right. Well, yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me and thank you for organizing this excellent event. As you know, I'm Australian. My parents are from Sri Lanka, but nowadays I live in Dubai. One thing I've found now, my story with Bitcoin, I first really got excited about it in, let's say, late 2012, early 2013. And I was one of those people shouting from the rooftops, right? Just absolutely... it's a phase many people go through. When you first, as I'm sure many of you can relate to, you become that guy, right? I'm sure, put your hands up if you've been that guy at some point, okay? Pretty much all of us, right? At some point, you're shouting from the rooftops, you're trying to get through to people, but then you realize most of them don't want to be saved, right? And it's like that meme, I'm sure you've all seen the meme, hey, you catch the game last night, right? So nowadays in Australia, they've got this misinformation bill going on where essentially they are going to create a Ministry of Truth and they will now penalize any social media websites for allowing, not allowed opinions. And they're basically asleep at the wheel. If you talk to a typical Australian, what are you going to hear them say? Did you catch the game last night? Right? That's the level we're working at. So for my talk, just a few brief ideas on what I've been reading and thinking about and, different ideas. I think there's an element to which you just have to recognize you can't save everybody, right? You just have to focus on who is willing to listen, right? So you put your material out there or just let them know that you're willing to help them, whether that's putting out podcasts or writing books or doing articles. Just try to help people understand, at least the ones who are willing to learn, whether that's, they want to learn something about Austrian economics, they want to learn a bit about liberty, they want to learn about why fiat currency and central banking is bad, all of these issues. But fundamentally, I think there's an element to which it's about sort of elites versus counter-elites, right? Like there are just kind of power battles going on in the background. And I think one thing that Bitcoin is going to do is change the group of elites. Right? As Bitcoin goes through this monetization, this hyper-Bitcoinization phase, I think there will be a whole new round of elites who come up because they were hodling Bitcoin and now they have more power and influence in the world and they can start turning the screws a little bit in terms of how they allow governments to treat them. So if a government starts to be too punitive in terms of taxes and regulation or too unjust in terms of what they do, people will now have alternatives. People will say, hey, you know what? I can go somewhere else. If you're going to do that to me, I'm just going to go. And we're starting to see this now. Even in the UK, there are a lot of high net worth individuals who are basically exploring leaving because of the punitive taxes coming in. As I'm sure many of you know, in the US, there's discussion. Kamala wants to do an unrealized gains tax. And of course, they sell the message as, it'll only be the 100 million, people above 100 million. Of course, if you've studied any amount of history, these things often start at a certain threshold and then they come down further. And even studying that, obviously, first of all, it's unethical. It's not okay to steal from someone just because they're rich, first. Secondly, just because you're stealing only from the rich people doesn't mean you're going to only harm the rich people. You're going to actually harm everyday people too, that capital is invested in businesses that are providing jobs or providing products and services that we all use. And so, there's all these issues around that. I think one area that, it's kind of puzzling to me that all these people just kind of repeat the regime propaganda. They just kind of, and not just that, it's not like there's necessarily one guy in the back pulling all the strings. It's more like there's this concept of the cathedral, right? Like these people go to, let's say, university and they sort of get inculcated into certain ways of thinking. And in a sense, this is what, those of us who are kind of arguing in favor of Bitcoin and freedom of speech and freedom of money and freedom in terms of liberty and economics, we're battling against that in a sense. Because the cathedral, the operatives of the cathedral will take it on themselves to go out and try to police certain kinds of thought or certain kinds of behavior. And the challenge also is that within the state, people talk about, a nation of laws and not of, people. And yeah, okay, the US government has this constitution, and yet it still manages to break free of that and do all kinds of things that are, bombing and spying on everyone and all kinds of things. Now, how can that happen? I think it's that ultimately it's people who are still in charge. And so, in theory, yeah, okay, there's the legislative, there's the executive, and the judiciary, and they're meant to be separate. Theoretically, they should be holding each other in check as a kind of balance of power. But what happens in practice? Well, someone can get voted in, they can change who the Supreme Court judges are, which in turn changes the judiciary. The cathedral pumps out all this, thought, propaganda, to try to force people or push people to think a certain way. And anyone who's following the work of Mike Benz has seen, he's been really exposing a lot of how the US government, three-letter agencies, and the Department of State have been doing all this kind of stuff in terms of election interference, interfering in other countries. Now, historically, maybe in the 50s and the 60s and so on, they did it under the guise of, we're stopping the communists, right? So if there was an election, they would try to stop the communist part, the communist-aligned people, because that would help the US government's interests. But nowadays, that same machinery is being aligned and used to attack the populist right in many countries around the world, as well as in the US, you could argue. So even though, you can sort of have this idea of what good governance would look like, in practice, what's happening is you get this cathedral, you get these this blob, as Mike Benz calls it, this blob of people who are just kind of controlling things in the background, and there's not necessarily something you can point to. It's kind of like Jello on the wall. How do you nail that Jello to the wall? Because it's here, it's there, it's this person, it's that person. They're all sort of engaging in propaganda behavior to try to frame things in a way that's beneficial for them and bad for everyday people. So I think coming out of that, though, what happens? You end up in these situations and in societies that are very backwards thinking. They've lost their ability to sort of create new ways of thinking and advance those. A great example would be, look at the EU. Look at how the EU works now. They think that just by regulating every little thing, that's their superpower, right? It's almost like, it's a stupid example you might have heard. Like, imagine you're standing in a bucket and you think that you can pull the bucket, you can raise that bucket by lifting the bucket while standing in the bucket. That is the level that some of these governments and politicians are at. They haven't had real discipline exposed and applied to them. Of course, I believe a Bitcoinized world will apply a certain level of discipline to them. It's going to take some time to get there, though. But what's my point with some of these things? The state expands by sometimes taking control or undermining other institutions. The family, the community, the church. By undermining these other institutions and then replacing it with itself, it is able to keep a population dependent. Right? They are able to say, hey, you don't need to have your own children. We've got this welfare state for you. Hey, you don't need to educate your own children. We've got a government schooling system for you. We've got this government guild system. And if you want to go anywhere, and if you want a career, you need to pass through our government guild. And at this university, you'll learn all kinds of things, and you'll be inculcated into a certain way of thinking that's beneficial for them, and not necessarily for us. So I think the message I'm trying to get to here is that, to an extent, now let me thread this needle correctly, right? I'm not saying you have to go and do everything yourself, because hey, if you understand economics, right, if you've read Safe's books and you understand we need specialization of labor, we need division of labor. There is such a thing as economies of scale. You can't just go and do everything yourself, right? Now, sometimes that's like this kind of fantasy people have in their mind of, I'm going to go live on the farm and do everything myself. And okay, to some extent maybe, but it's not. So let me explain it this way. The state has taken away some of people's power by undermining the private institution and putting itself in as the alternative. So then if you want some of your freedom back, it means you might have to learn to take on some of those things yourself. Now, maybe that's not all at an individual level. As an example, it could happen maybe, like I think, as an example in the US, in the United States case, it may be that certain functions need to be done by the state level in order to not be done at the federal level. Right? And so it's like this idea of trying to, how do you decentralize it further down, right? How do you take it, and that we may see further directions in this, as an example, secession movements, we may see breakaways, right? So a lot of people have in their mind this idea that, oh, the map of the world and the countries are they're just ordained, from on high, and they just have to stay that way. But what if I told you the number of nation states in the world, now I'm not sure the exact number, but it's approximately right, it has tripled since World War II. Right? That might seem kind of crazy, right? Like, what? How come there were so many new countries created? Well, it's because some of these countries were the result of independence. They were the result of the breakdown of, let's say, the Soviet, Union. And you've had all these other countries break down. So, as an example, Serbia and Montenegro, Czechia and Slovakia, Norway breaking away from Sweden, and of course, there are secession movements around the world even today. The Scottish independence movement, the Catalonians in Spain. So what I'm saying is, I think we have to, also separate the world that we ideologically want and the world that's likely. Right now, I believe, if we could privatize everything and have anarcho-capitalism or private law society, I mean, that would be about the best we could do. But is it going to happen in my lifetime? Probably not. What's more likely is maybe smaller states, maybe like city-states, maybe monarchies, maybe free private cities. I think these kinds of ideas, and by allowing and enabling more breakaways, let's say, I think that's going to allow more competition and choice. And obviously, Bitcoin is a super important part of this, but it's not the only piece. I think Bitcoin is the most important technology for liberty, but it's not the only technology. Of course, there are other technologies that are super important, things like cryptography, being able to, do internet, use the internet to give ourselves more freedom. But I think the takeaway for me is, I think we are now in an age where you have an opportunity to try to dispel propaganda narratives, and we should take that opportunity. I think it's a good opportunity. So I think those are probably the key messages, which is to try to speak the truth, try to counter if you see a false narrative, you have to try to do what you can to counter that. I think the last few years of the COVID tyranny have sort of really made that clear, that because there weren't enough people speaking about certain issues, it was people just believed that was the majority view, when maybe that wasn't really the view. It was just that there was this kind of there was a big silent majority. So, yeah, overall, I mean, I'm very bullish on Bitcoin over the next year or so. I think, if you're kind of zooming out and thinking from a macro perspective, it's the global liquidity, right? That seems to be, an explanation that's gaining some currency right now. Lynn Alden speaking about that. I think she recently commissioned a report by Sam Callahan talking about that as well. All indicators there look like we're about to sort of start the next round of global liquidity, and so that should portend well for Bitcoin, right? So I think what we're likely to see is maybe gold will also pump a little bit, but I think Bitcoin will pump much more than gold. And over time, we might need a few more cycles of this thing. I don't think it's, we're going to hyper-Bitcoinize in the next year or two, but it's a process, and give it a few cycles, and I think people will really look back and think, wow, how could the world have just changed so quickly? This money that was formed, online by an anon that had no marketing budget, no CEO, no office. It really is, when you zoom out and you just really think about it, it's going to be incredible. But it's just going to take some time to get there. And I think that's the final message is just kind of patience. You have to sort of be prudent and patient. And keep repeating yourself, even though it gets boring. That's just part of the message. That's part of how you kind of get through to people. So I'll leave you with that.
Okay, thank you, Stephan.